project here at the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. APA is a private nonprofit located in Washington, D.C., serving prosecutors as well as their law enforcement and community partners. Thank you for joining our Wednesday Child Abuse Prosecution webinar today. Today's webinar, It Really Didn't Happen, Recantations of Child Sexual Abuse, will be presented by Andrea Chamberlain. This presentation is made possible by a grant received from the Office of Justice Programs through the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. APA is very appreciative of their financial assistance and commitment to improving the justice system. Points of view or opinions in this presentation are those of the presenter and do not necessarily represent the views of the United States Department of Justice and the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. By the conclusion of the webinar, you will be emailed a short electronic survey to complete regarding this presentation. If you leave a question in the comment section of the survey, please include your email address so we can respond back to you. This survey helps us to continue to provide quality training to you at no cost to your jurisdiction and assists in future planning for continuing legal education. We are in the process of receiving 1 credit of CLE certification from the state of Virginia for this program and will email you your certificate when available. Please do not leave the webinar early as we will use the attendee reports to verify attendance for CLE purposes. During today's webinar, you will be able to submit questions to our speaker using the question box on your GoToWebinar toolbar located on the right side of your screen. These questions will be forwarded to our speaker and we will try to cover the issue during the live presentation. There's a lot of material that will be covered by our presenters today and we may have to follow up with you via email following the webinar. If you need additional assistance, please feel free to contact us directly following the presentation. Today's presenter, Andrea Chamberlain, is a child forensic interview specialist and trainer for the National Children's Advocacy Center, where she specializes in teaching participants how to conduct developmentally appropriate, legally sound interviews with children. She has presented at numerous local, regional, state, national, and international child abuse conferences on child forensic interviewing and multidisciplinary team functioning, and has trained hundreds of forensic interview specialists, prosecutors, law enforcement, therapists, client advocates, social workers, and children's advocacy center staff from the United States and other countries since 2000. I will now turn it over to our presenter, Andrea Chamberlain.
Thank you, Amy. Well, good morning, everyone. It's really exciting to be here with you today. And we are going to be, let me see if I can make sure that I can get this off. So,
you're good.
Okay, Amy, I just want to say I'm showing something that says GoToWebinar. Can everyone else see that, or are they just on my screen?
Nope, we can just see your screen.
Okay, all right, well, we're great then. So, good afternoon, everyone. So excited to be here today and partnering with the APA and offering you this particular webinar on how to react and what to do when children have recantations of child sexual abuse. And I do think it's so important that for us to fully understand the complexity of disclosure of child sexual abuse, it is so necessary to consider the potential consequences to children once they make that disclosure. And for many of these children, these consequences are dramatic. Oftentimes, they're making decisions that they just want the abuse to stop, but they're not really prepared for the system response. And folks, we are part of the system. Law enforcement, child protective services, children advocacy center staff, prosecutors, we are the system. And oftentimes our response to children and children once they become involved with us, all control is lost. And these consequences, they're not prepared for these consequences. And folks, oftentimes what children are not prepared for is how do parents respond. And you know, for some children, their parents are appropriate, they believe their children, they support their children. And unfortunately, for so many others, their parents are not supportive. I've worked in the Children's Advocacy Center field conducting interviews for 20 years, and unfortunately it's been my experience that we have many more parents that are not supportive and not believing of their children, more so than parents who do support. So for these children whose parents are not supportive, oftentimes, unfortunately, their parents call them liars. They maybe blame them for the abuse and saying, well, it's your fault that your dad did something. Or it may be that they totally discount the claims and say, you're lying, it didn't happen. Oftentimes, if these children are not removed out of the home and they go home and the parents are non-offending, caretaker is not supportive, a lot of these kids end up also being physically abused as well, because supposedly, and I'm putting this in quotes, they lied. So truly, I guess when you think about it, it's not surprising then that children recant true allegations of child sexual abuse. And what we're going to be doing in this particular training, we're going to be looking at the prevalence of recantation. We're going to be looking at the variables that are found to predict recantation, and we're going to be looking beyond what we've known for many years. We're going to also examine methods that can be taken when that first outcry, that first formal interview of a child takes place. We're going to be looking at how we can improve that interview. We're going to talk about methods to implement after a child recants. So in other words, instead of just saying, okay, we're done, the child's recanted, are there some other things we can do? And we're going to talk about what can we do as a system to assist that child after a recantation. And folks, we're also going to examine the system interventions for vulnerable children and working to maybe from the very beginning, once a child becomes involved with us, again, the system, what we can do. So one of the things that we're going to be talking about is just disclosure patterns. And so oftentimes what we know is that if we have inconsistencies, if we have recantations, that people will say, well, it's not a true allegation. And folks, what I want to tell you about inconsistencies in reports, that's the norm. That's the way human memory works. What I will tell you, if I have a child come in and everything is reported, they said to maybe the teacher, the counselor, the responding child protective service worker, law enforcement, if they have contact with these folks before they're brought in for that formal interview at a children's advocacy center, and there's no deviation, that is much more concerning to me than if there's inconsistencies. Because folks, if we're recounting something in our history, and if I talk to person A about, let's say, my vacation, and then I talk to maybe you as person B about my vacation, there's going to be some differences. And I'm probably not going to tell each one of you exactly the same thing. And that's inconsistencies, and that's the norm. And also, I think it's important to recognize that when we have inconsistencies, when we have recantation, people will use that and they will say that this child's no longer credible. And that's really unfortunate because we have so often, we absolutely have recantations of true allegations. And as you, as prosecutors, when you're working a case, you're preparing to go to court, and you may yourself have brought in experts. They could come in on the prosecution side, they could come in on defense counsel side, and they can testify in court as to the veracity of a children's report based on that disclosure pattern. So they may say, well, if there's inconsistencies, that means the child is lying. If there's a recantation, that means a child is lying. And again, that's so not the case in many of the children cases that we work. So I want us to think about this. Do children tell us when sex abuse is happening in the home? Do they tell? And folks, it depends. Probably not the answer that you wanted, but it's what we have to give. So there's several things that I want you to think about. So is it a disclosure? And a disclosure means that the child has thought about telling, that They are aware of the consequences of telling, that they have a purpose for that disclosure. Generally, they want the abuse to stop. Or is it a sharing of a confidence? So let's think about the difference between the two. If I'm 10 years old, if you're 10 years old, let's say, and you're in school, and school's been going for a couple of months now, and you have, let's say you have several teachers, but your homeroom teacher is pretty neat, and you spend some time talking with that teacher, and you really like your homeroom teacher, and you feel like, hey, you know, you're a good friend. And I tell you, hey, I've got something to tell you. You just got to promise not to tell. And finally, the homeroom teacher says, I promise. And then the 10-year-old discloses child sexual abuse. And because they're mandated reporter, the teacher makes a call and reports that either to law enforcement or Child Protective Services. And the next thing you know, the child is now involved in the system. And what we have to ask ourselves, then when that child, who was really, it's a sharing of a confidence, it's not a disclosure, they come in and someone's interviewing that child, whether it's a first responder, maybe a CPS worker comes out and they do what they call a screening interview, or maybe a first responder, a law enforcement comes out and does a screening interview. And that child wasn't prepared for the system to become involved. They hadn't really thought beyond, I just need to tell somebody. They may say, no, that was a misunderstanding. I didn't say that. It didn't happen. And so the influence, the motivation to tell about the abuse was, I just need to get it off my chest. I need to talk to someone. But I hadn't made a decision to really disclose. And then we have to ask ourselves, looking at, do children tell? Do they have the ability to tell us? And I think this is so incredibly important, because in order for a child to communicate what's happened in their lives, we have to ask, do they have the cognitive ability to talk with us? Do they have, what are their receptive language skills? Can they understand our questions? What are their expressive language skills? Do they have the ability to kind of shift through all these memories, put them together, and then formulate a response to our question in such a way that we can understand? And I will say our system is weighed heavily toward some sort of verbal response. Even when children sometimes write their disclosure because they have a hard time speaking that disclosure, there's been times when team members are like, we really need them to say what happened. And, you know, my response is they are saying. They're saying it through the written word, not through verbal communication. And another thing that we have to ask ourselves when we think about the challenges children face when we're talking about disclosure is the adult recipient, are they able to hear what's being said? So if you've got a 5-year-old child and they talk to their mom and they say, hey mom, you know, Uncle Joe has funny underwear. And in their mind, in their little mind, they're disclosing, they're telling, they're wanting this funny stuff with Uncle Joe to quit. So they're going to say he's got funny underwear. And mom's like, oh, you're just being silly. And mom doesn't pay any more attention to that. Or if the child says, maybe parents are separated, divorced, they're not together, but maybe the child has hopefully visitation with dad, if dad's a good person, and the child comes home and says, Mom, Dad hurt my pee-pee. And mom's like, yeah, well, you know, I know he's got a baby and he hasn't done that much before. And in the child's mind, they're disclosing, but the adult just can't hear because they don't want to believe, one, something like this could happen to their child, or two, they may know the individual and not believe that they could do something that would harm their child. So folks, as we talk about disclosure, this particular study, 2011, was a really great study because they came in and they interviewed children 8 to 18 years of age. They conducted an interview with them, and they also talked to some parents. So this was really nice. And what they were wanting to know, kind of what was the process of disclosure, what finally happened when the kids decided to tell, what was happening that, boom, they went from not talking about the abuse to now they're telling. And one of the things that they found, and I think this is so important, so we're going to talk more about the pressure cooker effect on the next slide, but folks, I want you to think about this. When we say the experiences of disclosure is multi-determined, if you're my best friend, we're 10, you're my best friend, and I disclose to you, I disclose to my homeroom teacher because I have a relationship with my homeroom teacher, that in no way means that I'm prepared to talk with law enforcement or Child Protective Services. I'm not prepared to go to the CAC and talk to the forensic interviewer. I don't care how nice and child-friendly the center is or how appropriate the forensic interviewer is. I don't know you, and I'm not sure that I want to talk with you. And one of the children in this study, it was really great because what she said in effect that for the rest of her life, as she met new people, she was going to have to make a decision whether to share about her personal history. And so what she said is from that moment when she made her first disclosure, everyone that she came in contact with, she had to make that decision to disclose all over again. And just again, because she decides to tell one person doesn't mean that she was prepared to tell other people. So when kids are kind of containing that secret, and just because they determine that one person is safe to tell doesn't mean that another person is safe to tell. And again, there's a difference between telling and confiding. And in this particular study, again, what they were looking at and what they found is that some kids actively withhold telling. That even though it's bad, even though they find it really horrific and horrible and it makes them sad or mad or feel yucky or whatever kids think about what's unfortunately happening to them, that they can't talk about it. They don't want other people to know. And, so often kids come into the CAC and they ask, has this happened to you? They're asking the interviewer, which of course we're not going to answer that question. But what they're really wanting to know is, am I the only one? And they often believe that they're the only ones in their circle of friends or family that this is happening to, and they don't want other people to know. Even if asked, sometimes they're going to deny. So that in itself is problematic. And this whole issue of the pressure cooker effect, it's, I want to tell because I want it to stop, but I don't want to tell because I'm aware of the consequences, that if I talk and if I tell, is Mom going to be mad at me? Is Dad going to go to jail? Is my sister going to believe me? What's going to happen to Grandma? One 10-year-old that I interviewed years ago, she had written a note to her mom, and so that was the original disclosure. But then when she came in for the interview, you could see her literally try to form the words with her mouth. Nothing came out. So eventually, I came in and I did an extended forensic interview with her. And so when she was ready to transition, she started to talk about the maltreatment by her stepdad. But the question was, how come you couldn't tell in that first interview? And so that's what we were looking for. What was going on that just kept her from telling? And it was so interesting because she just kind of what we call word vomit, not the best phrase, I guess, but it really explains them just kind of gushing some language. And she was like, well, my mom, she's disabled and she's not going to be able to work, and how are we going to live? And my 15-year-old brother's going to have to drop out of school, and he's going to have to get a job, and he's going to have to support us. And if my grandmother finds out, she may have a heart attack and she may die. And so all of these things are coming out. So this child had all of these reasons for not telling. She wanted to tell because she was frightened, she was scared, she was so worried about it escalating but at the same time, she was really looking at what were the consequences going to be. Another thing that we have to look at is, as children kind of prepare to tell, they're trying to decide who they can tell. Can I trust you with my secret? Can I trust that you'll support me? Will you believe me? And so these are all things that are impacting children's ability to talk with us. In another particular study, even though this is an older study, it was really great in the fact that it broke down, looking at, again, at children and who they decided to tell and what was that process. There's this preparation that goes into effect. So the child's like, you know, I've really got to talk with someone. I don't know how much more I can take this, but who can I talk to? And so they're looking at kind of that confident selection, how they believe that that person may react. And folks, I want you to think about the reaction, because that's very key when it comes time to children talking about what's happened to them. There was a study that was done in Israel a couple of years ago. One of the authors of that study was Michael Lamb. And they took kids who had come into the system, and they were being interviewed. And these children were all alleging abuse by someone outside the family. So it was not a parent or a family member. So this was someone outside the family that had allegedly abused these kids. And they asked the children, how do you think your parents or your caretakers are going to respond? And folks, it was interesting because 93% of those children pegged it. They knew how their parents were going to respond. So it's not just about who do I decide to tell, but how do I think that parent's going to react? And that's going to, or that recipient is going to react. And that's going to make a difference in a child's ability to talk with whoever their confidant is. So we're looking at that. So they're looking at, you know, who will believe me, what's that going to look like? And folks, I also want you to think about this. The kids that we come into contact with in the system are just the tip of an iceberg, because when you look at the cost benefit of telling about child sexual abuse, what you're going to find is that the benefits of telling are not near as high as the cost of telling. So the benefit of telling may be the abuse stops. So no one's touching my TT anymore, no one's making me do things that I don't want to do. I'm not having to take my clothes off. I'm not having to watch videos. So the abuse has stopped. So that might be the benefit. The cost may be that the non-offending caretaker or other family members don't believe you. It may be that your siblings aren't talking to you. It may be that your family implodes. It may be that if, you know, dad or the stepdad may be the only one working in the home, that all of a sudden they can't make rent and they're evicted. So the cost to telling about child sexual abuse is truly extremely high for our children, whereas the benefit may not be as high. And sometimes in trying to determine what's better, do I tell and I risk all of these other things happening, does that outweigh the cost? And so those are some things that we have to look at when we're talking with these children. So, you know, and what do children expect? Do they expect that they're going to be believed and supported? Do they expect their parents will believe what they're saying, or that other family members will believe what they're saying? Or do they expect this disbelief and punishment? And folks, a lot of times kids, again, looking back at that Israeli study, they know how their parents are going to react. And it can be really, really bad. We had a child a couple of years ago that came into the CAC, and the presenting allegation was severe physical abuse. And bless this, oh my goodness, this child, she was beaten, she had bruises all over her body. And as we're talking to her about, you know, what's happened, and she starts sharing that her mom beat her, and so trying to look at, well, what prompted mom to kind of go off like this? And she said, well, I told my mom about my uncle having sex with me, and mom called me a liar. and she was beating me because she said I shouldn't lie. And so that's how it came out that there was sexual abuse issues. And so for this child, she thought her mom would be supportive, and what she found out is mom was absolutely not supportive because this was her brother. And it's also important to look at, do the expectations of children differ depending on who they elect to tell, who, what is their age, what's their life experiences, and, again, these consequences, or what they perceive to be the consequences, may definitely impact if they tell and who they tell. So, folks, in this particular study, again, looking at what do children expect, in this study, the purpose of the study was to help our understanding, advance our understanding of children's decision to disclose adult wrongdoing, and this is just a really, really great study. They had 235 children in this study, and their ages 4 to 9. And half of the children in this study were children that were in care of Child Protective Services in Los Angeles County. So these children had been removed from their homes in Los Angeles County because of maltreatment. So that was half of the sample. And the other half of the sample was children that there was no belief that there had been any maltreatment with these children. And so they were trying to determine, did the children have a preference for whom they disclosed to? What were their expectations of consequences once it was disclosed that an adult had done something wrong? And did, age or the relationship between the child and the alleged offender make a difference? And what happened is that these children were given 3 different little vignettes that described a story child disclosing or potentially disclosing wrongdoing committed by an adult. And that adult was either, in the stories, was a mother, a father, or a stranger. Their choice of disclosure recipient, who they were telling, was either going to be a mother, a grandmother, a policewoman, or a policeman. Now, interesting enough, a disclosure recipient was not a father. And the reason for this, according to the researchers, is that historically, the majority of children do not disclose to dads. So that's a whole other issue, which we're not going to go in today, but it was just very interesting. And this is what they found. They found that the older children recognized that disclosure recipients, I'm sorry, folks, I'm going to go back, that they found that the older the children got, that they really preferred to disclose to a parent, so more so to a caretaker. So, and again, they had an issue, their choices were mom or grandma versus a policewoman or a policeman. So when they were a little bit younger, that very first part of the age group, there was no difference there. Now, if the person doing the wrongdoing was a stranger, we didn't have any age differences, so the preference was, again, talking to a caretaker. And the older children, now folks, this is where it comes into play for you and I, is that if the person doing the wrongdoing was, in these little vignettes, was a parent, so that was the mom or the dad, these children felt like that there would be more skepticism and maybe more disbelief versus if it was a stranger. And also the older children felt like that if the accused was a parent, that maybe there would be less formal intervention. In other words, that, again, because of that skepticism, that maybe law enforcement wouldn't be called in. So, again, trying to understand that children are recognizing the different challenges when there may be a parent that's accused. So, folks, here, what the research tells us is that, again, gradual disclosures, recantation, inconsistencies are common, and that if you look at adult survey recipients, so these are adults that agree to participate in a survey about child sexual abuse, that a large percentage, in fact, it's the majority of these adults, say that they never disclosed the abuse when they were a child. So in other words, the children that we do see are probably the minority. We're not seeing all of these kids. And interesting, in this study by Lyons in 2007, Lyons went back and he went through 20 years of studies that were done on children who were diagnosed with genital gonorrhea, and just looking at, did they tell, did they not, what was happening with these kiddos. And what he found is that oftentimes that children present, let's say, at a hospital for a medical reason. They're not presenting at the hospital because they've said, I've been sexually abused, someone's done something to me. It's because they have a medical issue. It's determined at the hospital that they have gonorrhea. And so knowing that this is going to be given to the child because of sexual contact, that even then, less than 50% of the children disclosed abuse. So this is telling us that a large percentage of children don't disclose, so that means the percentage of children that we do see is pretty small. And in these particular studies, it was really interesting just looking at the recantation rates across studies. And folks, it has ranged anywhere from a 1996 study, and there are some kind of challenges with the samples in that study, and so that ranged from 4% to up to 27%. But in this particular study by Malloy, Lyons, and Quas in 2007, they looked at recantation rate and substantiated abuse. And these were, again, dependency cases in California, Los Angeles County, and they had found that they were substantiated. There was kind of a gold standard that we truly believed these children had been sexually abused. And what they said is that they found no evidence that cases involving recantations of abuse were less likely to be true, and that even with evidence to support the allegations, and that evidence could be eyewitnesses, it could be, you know, pictures or videos, video stills, it could be medical evidence, physical evidence, that even with evidence to support the allegation, that there was still a large percentage of children who recanted. So they were recanting what was believed to be true allegations. And folks, this other study, a 2014 study, was really interesting, because what they did is they looked again at cases with corroborating evidence, which so often we just don't have. But in this particular study, that's what they looked at, is cases with corroborating evidence. And then they looked at cases that did not have that corroboration, and truly that's the majority of our cases. But what they found is there was the same, approximately the same recantation rate. So even kids where there was high probability of the disclosure being true, we still had about a 25% recantation rate. So kind of across the board. And it's important for us to have this comprehensive, really understanding of recantation, and certainly I think it's important for us to look at the risk factors, because what's going to happen is if you're working a case, if there's a case that is presented, it goes through the investigation, it's presented to your prosecutor's office, and y'all are making a decision about moving forward, or maybe you've made that decision and you're getting ready to go to court, then you get a call and you find out that this child has made either an informal recantation to, you know, maybe to mom or grandma or to dad or to someone that, hey, I know I said this about Uncle Joe, but it really didn't happen, versus a formal recantation where they're coming in and they're talking to either you or to law enforcement, and they're saying, no, it didn't happen. So either informal or formal, what's going to happen is that now we've got some doubt. And is it going to be harder to prove up this case because we have this recantation? And we have to, what's going to be important for us to do is we have to identify, I think beforehand, which children are at risk for recantation. What can we do about it? How do we How do we handle this if that recantation comes about? And we've got to start targeting these kids and looking at what we can offer these children so that by the time the case does go forward, that we've supported them in every way that we can. So looking at this again, particular study, this 2007 study, this is what we know already. We've known this for a really long time, that younger children have a higher recantation rate. If a child is abusing or alleging abuse against a parental figure, mom, dad, stepmom, stepdad, a caretaker, someone who has daily care, contact with that child, that you're going to have higher recantation rates. That if we have a non-supportive caretaker, generally a mom, we're going to have higher recantation rates. So we've known this for a great deal of time. Now, if you look at that last bullet, I'm referencing a 2016 study that just came out. And again, they're looking at adult wrongdoing. And it was very interesting. They're, again, looking at children 6 to 9. And these are children, they're not saying that these children had been abused, but what they did is these children participated in an experiment. So it's an analog study. They interacted with the researcher, and during that interaction, a puppet was broken. And what happened is the kids were interviewed about that interaction, and they told about, you know, the puppet breaking, or if the ones that disclosed about the researcher breaking the puppet. Now, interesting enough, some of the children tried to minimize what the researcher had done. But for the ones that did disclose, the parents had been kind of coached to either react supportively or non-supportively, and this is where the real experiment was coming in. So for the kids that disclosed, and their parents or their moms reacted negatively after that initial interview. And folks, this is key, because this is a really high number. 46% of those kids recanted. So these are true disclosures about adult wrongdoing. Moms were non-supportive, and kids recanted. Now that was, you know, approximately 23% of the total amount of children in the study. But again, so we're looking at half the kids had supportive moms, half of them didn't. So it just went, and it's saying, yes, we know that if we don't have a supportive mom, we're going to have recantation. That's a high probability. And this is saying, you know, we've got over 45% of the kids that are alleging a true wrongdoing are coming back and recanting because their moms are non-supportive. Now, in an additional study that also came out this year with one of the same researchers, Malloy, they took, folks, this is a really great study because it's the largest sample of substantiated child sexual abuse cases involving recantations to date. So they took 58 children who had recanted. And these were, again, recanting kind of what we consider gold standard cases where there was high probability there was evidence that abuse had taken place. And they compared these 58 children, and so they matched them with children who did not recant. And they looked at, you know, children as far as about the same age, allegations were against even, you know, family members, and that there was caregiver unsupportiveness. And folks, what they found in this particular study, very interesting again, and I will say that their definition of recantation was pretty broad, that we either had, again, a very formal or informal recantation, but again, the reason that they had it so broad was knowing that even if it's not a formal recantation, that is going to cast some doubt on the veracity of the original statement. And so this is what they found, is that yes, we know that if we have a non-offending caretaker, and again, like I said, generally that's a mom, that we have a higher recantation. But what they found in this particular study is that if there were other people in the family that were disbelieving, So let's say grandma doesn't believe, or your siblings don't believe, or aunt and uncle don't believe, that once we had other people in the family saying, don't believe you, we had an increase in recantations. That children who, now this is very interesting, that generally we think oftentimes if a mom's non-supportive or we have an unsupportive caretaker, that it's going to be best to move the children. And this is what they found, that if the children stayed in that home, there was a higher instance of recantation, which just kind of goes along with that first bullet. And then, too, if there's visitation allowed between the child and the alleged offender, we have a slight uptick in recantation, which just makes sense. Because if, the child gets to visit dad, or dad gets to call from jail and talks to the child and says, honey, I really don't like it here, I want to come home, who's going to take care of your mom, it's going to just make sense that they're probably going to recant just a little bit more. And so, folks, what we know is that if we can at least get one other person, we can get at least one supportive family member. So whether it's outside of the non-offending caretaker, but if we can get one other person that is supportive of that kiddo, generally an adult, we're going to have less recantation. So, and then again, when this kind of goes back to the bullet on the previous page, if the kids are, initially removed out of that home, they're less likely to recant. And this is saying that if children are initially separated from their siblings. So let's say sometimes Child Protective Services will come in and they'll remove all of the kids, and they'll put the kids together in a foster home or in a relative placement. What they found is that because those siblings may not believe, there's a higher chance of recantation. So they're saying that potentially maybe if we could remove some of these kids from their siblings, at least initially, until services are in place perhaps, that there's less likely that these kids are going to recant. So ultimately what we have to ask ourselves is, what does this mean for the kiddos? And we have to look at, do we have someone that believes that child? And what does it mean to have continuing contact with siblings and the alleged offender? And that we really have to pay attention to not just the non-offending caretaker, but we've got to look beyond that to other family members and potentially contact with siblings. So, folks, what this is really saying for us as a whole is that we have to look beyond what we normally know about recantation. So if there is a younger child, if the non-offending caretaker is not supportive, if the allegation is against a parental figure, we know we have a high chance of recantation. But we also have to think, if we have other family members who don't believe, if we have siblings that don't believe, if there's continued contact with the alleged offender, we have even higher chances of recantation. And that we as a system, when that child comes into the system, we've got to start looking at these other factors. Because if we don't, and let's say this child does make a true disclosure initially, but then we have all of these risk factors and we do nothing to intervene on these risk factors, these kids are probably going to recant. And then we know, it's so often the case, when they recant, our case is kind of done, and these kids go home and the abuse continues. So, asking ourselves, in the beginning, that initial interview, so I'm not talking about the screening interview, I'm not talking about CPS coming out or law enforcement coming out and doing a brief interview with the child to determine, hey, we're going to take them to the Children's Advocacy Center, we're going to have somebody come in, we're going to do this really formal interview where we record this with the child. We've got to do that immediately. And I stress this because I was in a training in another state last week, and I was told this one particular agency that they had a 3-week waiting list for the kids. And folks, I cannot tell you on how many levels that that's inappropriate, and it's very, very damaging to these kids. So we've got to interview these kids before they regret that disclosure, while it's still fresh and they feel like that somebody is listening, before there's pressure from other people to change that story. Certainly for our itty-bitty kids, if this was, let's say, a one-time abuse by someone in the family, so we've got a 4 or 5-year-old, and we have to make them wait 3 weeks, their ability to give us a great deal of information about that has just, we've just lost that. It's been torpedoed. And also, we don't want there to be suggestive influences that can be blamed for the allegation. Well, you know, your mom's just mad at Dad because he's got a new girlfriend and now she's saying he's doing these things to you. So we've got to move pretty fast. And folks, we have to do what's considered a narrative interview. I cannot stress this enough, that when I say narrative interview, we have to do this from the beginning of the interview throughout the interview. And I'm going to give you an example of what someone called rapport but wasn't. So this was an interview that I peer-reviewed a while back, and these were the questions that were asked. What's your name? How old are you? What grade are you in at school? What's your teacher's name? What's your favorite subject? And then they went into the rules. And so I'm asking, where's rapport? And they're like, well, that was rapport. And I'm like, nope, that was not. That was in no way considered an effective rapport in the interview, because there was, none of those questions were designed to elicit a narrative. None of those questions were really designed to have the child be an expert. They're just giving us 1 or 2 word answers. That's not a narrative interview. That's an interrogation. And so rapport building is more, tell me about yourself. Tell me about some things you like to do. Tell me some more, and then what happened, and tell me the next thing. So we're just trying to get all this rich narrative response. Then after that rapport building, we have this narrative practice, which feels like rapport, and it is a continuation of rapport, but it's designed to teach the child to give us the information you as prosecutors and investigators need. It's designed to get the who, the what, the where, the when, and the how, because kids don't understand the forensic demands. And what we're trying to do is show them that if they do make a disclosure later, we're going to need all of this type of information. So generally what we do is we take, let's say in rapport building, the child talked to me about going bow hunting with Dad. So in this narrative practice piece, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, tell me about one time you went bow hunting with your dad. And I'm going to have that child just walk me through it. Well, tell me the first thing you did when you went bow hunting, and then tell me the next, and what happened after that. And I'm going to try in that richness of the narrative to get the who, the what, the where, the when, and the how. And then, again, developmentally appropriately, so many kids struggle with our when questions, but we're going to try to get that as open-ended as possible. And then if we still need some information, we may come back with our more closed-in questions. So, folks, if you're looking at and you're assessing interviews, what I want you to be looking at is how open-ended were the questions from beginning to end. And if the majority of them are very much yes-no questions, or those forced choice questions, or the closed, what we call closed WH, what color was the car, that's not a narrative interview. Also, it's very important that we look at video documentation, not just audio, but video. So that's going to be the best way to capture the nuances of that interview, because so much of communication is the gestures and the facial expressions. Just like as we're talking here, or I'm talking with you today, I am talking to a computer screen, and you can't see me, and I can't see you. And so there's a part of this whole communication exchange that we're losing because of just the method that we have today. But in an interview with a child, everything is important, and we really need to look at video documentation. So, folks, that initial interview, and as you're assessing interviews, deciding to move a case forward or not, You really want to be looking at how open-ended are the questions. Again, looking at the number of yes, no, and multiple choice questions in Civic W-8, because if that's the majority of the interview, it is a non-narrative interview. It's more than likely a bad interview. So let's say we've done a really great narrative interview, but golly, now we have a recantation. What do we do? Where do we go? And what I'm going to tell you first and foremost, I would encourage you to have a formal second interview with this child. In essence, a recantation interview. Now, I'm not saying bring the child in and ask, well, were you lying before or are you lying now? That would be totally inappropriate. But what we want to do is I want to ask this child about their experiences since they talked with me last. Well, you know, we talked a while back and you told me about some things happening at home, and I just want to visit with you about how things are going. And I just you know, talk to me about how things have been since we've last talked. Have there been some changes in the family? How did everybody react? Because I'm just trying to explore what's their circumstances, how did life change for them, what can they tell me? And as we do this, I think it's also important to recognize that maybe in your jurisdiction you don't initially, when you're going through the guidelines, and this is very, very different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and it may depend on state statutes or just what you find appropriate in your jurisdiction. But some jurisdictions don't elicit a promise to tell the truth. And I can tell you the NCAC Child Forensic Interview Model, when we do the guidelines, we say, you know, it's important that we talk about things that are true and real. But I would say if you're doing a recantation interview, that there is some evidence from Tom Lyons. We haven't seen a great deal of this, but we have seen some evidence that a promise to tell the truth, that actual promise, does seem to have created an uptick in accuracy. So that might be something that you consider if you decide to do a second interview, and I am going to say I hope that you do. And so what you may find is that the child may eventually, as you're talking about, well, how have things been, and they say, well, Mom's been really sad, and, you know, we got our electricity turned off, or, you know, the truck got repossessed, and they talk about what's been going on, and you can just move that interview around to where they're really reaffirming that original allegation, and so that can be really important. Find that more so with the younger kids. Sometimes, you know, maybe the little bitties to maybe 8 or so tend to come in and they'll reaffirm that original allegation. Now, some kids will come in and they're just going to deny that prior disclosure. And the thing is, folks, doing a second interview, you haven't lost anything. That you've got that recantation to someone out there. And at that point, you're going to have to make a decision. Do we move forward with this case? Do we not? It's going to be really hard to prove up with this recantation. So you don't lose anything by conducting a second interview. I really think that it can be very important, and especially important for these kiddos, because if we just immediately drop the case and they go home and they're back in that home with an alleged offender, it may be very, very challenging for those kids. So let's say you're talking with a child and they are holding on to that recantation. Then you want to come back and you want to ask about motive. Well, you know, when we talked the first time, I need some help understanding. Before we talked, you had talked to your teacher and the school resource officer, and then you talked to me about some things that were happening at home. And I'm just trying to understand that if it didn't happen, talk to me about telling all these people the same thing. Or we could be asking, well, tell me everything you said the first time you talked to me again, trying to get them to reaffirm that. Or asking them just, you know, what made you say these things? What was going on that you said these the first time that we talked? And again, folks, it's It's acknowledging that they said something to you, even if the kids are saying, nope, 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 that's wrong, I lied. You just want to gently kind of push, and I don't want to say confront, but just kind of gently push to see where that could take you, because they may come back and they may reaffirm that recantation. And asking about, you know, what did your mom think or your dad think when you talked about what happened with your grandpa, or you know, now that you've said it didn't happen, what do you want to have happen? And it's just amazing how many kids will come back and say, well, I want things to go back. I don't want Dad to keep touching me, but I want Mom to be happy again. So in a way, they've just reaffirmed that original allegation. You can ask the kids, how did you feel about, you know, what Dad or Mom said after we talked the first time, and, you know, what do you want to happen now? I think these are crucial for us to come in to understand the pressures that the children have been under since they made that original allegation. And folks, it goes back to, again, that cost-benefit ratio. And what I can tell you is the cost for so many of these kids, the cost is going to so much more outweigh the benefit of talking to us. So as we close down, looking at suggestions for prevention and intervention, what we know is that the burden of proof is going to weigh very, very heavily on you when a child recants his or her testimony. And this is especially true in, as so many of our cases, we have no corroborating evidence, no physical evidence, and no eyewitnesses. And so what that means for us, and I think and I'm talking about us as a system now, as a whole, is that we've got to be looking from the beginning, from the first time a child comes into contact with the system. All of us need to be having eyes on this child and this family, and we need to be looking and assessing for possible future recantation. And that if you have a family advocate or a client advocate within your office, if there is hopefully somebody providing advocacy within a children's advocacy center, that the team, not only the advocates, but the team are really looking at what are the potentials for recantation with this child, and that we need to be providing some immediate resources. And I will tell you from a CAC standpoint, I think it's crucial that we not only offer support to the child that is alleging the abuse, but their siblings and their family members as well. Because if we've got a non-offending mom, let's say, who herself was abused as a child, and that is so often the case, and they've never dealt with their own stuff, they're in no way equipped to help this child. And that may mean that we have a mom that's disbelieving or non-supportive. So we've really got to start putting together something into place for everyone in this family. And oftentimes, folks, these parents or non-offending caretakers, they need somebody to talk to. So getting them plugged into a support group where other parents or caretakers are going through similar situations can be incredibly, incredibly helpful. And again, folks, looking at this it's not only going to benefit the family and the child, but this is going to help that case. And if we help the child, it helps the case. And, you know, families need information about what did the child say, what happened to them. And folks, I'm going to say that's very case dependent, very much dependent on your jurisdiction. I will tell you here, the interviewers and even the client advocates, it's up to law enforcement, it's up to Child Protective Services to inform the parents about what was said or what happened to that child, that it's not the forensic interviewer, it's not CAC staff, that's somebody else's job and decision because it is y'all's case. Parents also need to learn how to protect their children in the future, because so many times parents unfortunately keep picking or keep putting their children into danger, and we need to kind of break that cycle if we can. We need to, again, someone needs to be looking at these families, because if all of a sudden now we have financial instability, there's housing difficulties, transportation challenges, there's not enough food to eat, it's going to be really, really hard for a child to stick with that allegation when they see the consequences of some of these challenges here. So I would say that both within a CAC setting and both within the prosecutor's office, if you have family and client advocates, that it's up to them to help with the education and the emotional support so that they can encourage these families to be supportive of their children. It's only by doing that are we going to hopefully prevent recantations before they happen. And folks, I do think, bottom line, that looking at this particular quote, the knowledge that children recant true allegations because of social, familial, and environmental factors, it makes it incumbent on responding professionals to recognize the indicators that lead to recantations of child sexual abuse allegations. It's not only our job, it's our duty, and we have to do this to protect the kids. So I thank you for your time, and we'll check in with Amy to see if we've got any questions.
Yes, we do. We have a couple questions, and we have time to take them. So the first question that we have is, you said a child may deny a prior disclosure, which could be impeached. What exactly does that mean?
So we have had, in some of the jurisdictions that I've worked with in the past, it's very, very interesting. One of the jurisdictions that I worked at prior, they were taking cases where we had a really good disclosure, felt like it was a true disclosure, and even though the child had recanted and they were holding on to that recantation, the prosecutors had made the decision, we're moving forward. And so what would happen is they would move forward with the case, and I'm not sure how I feel about this, so I'm just saying that this is what happened, that they would put the child on the stand, and the child would recant that prior allegation. And then what would happen is they would come back and they would play the recording of the initial interview where the child was disclosing the abuse. And so in essence, the prosecutor was using that to kind of impeach the child's statement that they were lying. So it was kind of they weren't impeaching them about that original disclosure, but it was an impeachment really of that denial of abuse and the recantation. And I will say that when I was there, we had about a 50-50 guilty rate. So half of the cases it was either hung jury or not guilty, and half the cases they were the juries were finding the defendants guilty of the original charges.
Okay. How can parents protect their children if one parent has physical custody of a child and the other parent suspects the child has been abused?
Oh, now that's a tough question. So if we have, let me just make sure that I understand. If we've got a parent that has physical custody of the child and it's believed that they are conducting or they're abusing the child, well, definitely, I mean, the thing is, Child Protective Service, when they get involved in a case, maybe even law enforcement, depending on the state, they can't interfere with custody. And that case is going to have to go through the investigative process. So hopefully, child's brought to Children's Advocacy Center if there's one in your community, and that child is interviewed, and if they make a disclosure, the challenge becomes, hopefully, and Child Protective Services does the best they can in very, very limiting circumstances, I believe, where they will try to get that alleged offender to sign a safety plan, and a lot of times they don't, which is very unfortunate. But if that doesn't happen, what parents are going to have to do is go to court. And I can tell you that there's numerous times when we will interview children, and it's similar situations, and we are subpoenaed to testify in a hearing trying to modify custody or visitation because a parent, truly believes that something has happened to their child, and maybe the child even disclosed that in a forensic interview. This is one of those I don't know if there's a good answer to. I'll be real honest with you, because I think that at times our systems, they fail children. And oftentimes it depends on who has the best attorney when they go to court, when they go to family court, and sometimes I do think sometimes kids, unfortunately, have to spend time with their abusers because that's court ordered, because we just don't have enough to really make a difference in those kiddos' lives. I'm not sure that's an answer to your question, but I'm not sure there is an answer to that question.
Okay. Are there any national guidelines for forensic interviewers to re-interview victims after recantation?
No, there's really not. Some of the research that I gave you, and folks, if any of you want a list of the research articles that were referenced in this presentation, just email me. I'll be glad to send those to you. But there's not, and it just is dependent on the case. Oftentimes it's dependent on the jurisdiction. Sometimes, we'll have this recantation come in, and we often, CAC staff will be asking, the investigators, please bring that child in. We would really like the opportunity to re-interview them. And sometimes that happens, and sometimes it doesn't. Some CACs, they just say, we're not going to do that. I believe it really takes a lot of dialogue between the CAC staff and the investigators and the prosecutors. Ultimately, it's the prosecutor's case, and we certainly are going to be talking with our prosecutors before we ever attempt to do something like that. But I think, again, folks, we don't have anything to lose. You've got that recantation. It's out there on the table. We don't lose anything by talking to those kids again, and I do think there's so much pressure on these children that if we don't, we haven't done everything that we can. But there's no national standard.
Okay, and one final question. When doing a recantation interview, do you suggest having the same forensic interviewer that did the initial disclosure interview, or a new forensic interviewer?
I'm going to say just if you possibly can, I would stick with the same interviewer. There's already this level of trust that was developed initially between that child and the interviewer, especially if there was a disclosure. And I think that you can just build off that in the recantation interview. So definitely, I think if you can, I would stick with the same one.
Okay, great. That's all the questions that we have. Thank you, Andra, for a very informative and excellent presentation today. We appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you.
Sure. All APA webinar materials and recordings are available on our website. Please follow us on Twitter at APA_CAPP for upcoming events and webinars. If you have any questions or concerns, please email us at webinars@apainc.org. Thank you for attending, and have a great day.